Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Trudy Rubin and I write the Worldview Foreign Affairs column for the Inquirer. And today I'm delighted to have as my guest Fiona Hill, a senior fellow in the Center for the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution think tank in Washington. Fiona was formerly the top expert on Europe and Russian affairs at the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019, and she riveted the country with her courageous testimony at the impeachment hearings in November 2019. She has an amazing personal history, having grown up in poverty as a coal miner's daughter in northern England. Through grit and scholarship, she studied in Moscow and did a PhD at Harvard, and then served under 3 U.S. presidents. She recounts her rise from Coal House to White House in her fascinating new memoir, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Let me give you a look at it. And she compares the factors that have stimulated the rise of populism in the United States, in England, and in Putin's Russia. She also co-authored a biography of Vladimir Putin, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, in 2015. Given everything that's happening on Putin's watch, from massing troops on Ukraine's border to blackmailing Europe by threatening to cut off gas supplies to cyber hacking of U.S. cloud services, this couldn't be a more timely discussion. Before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping details. At any time during the discussion, you can submit your questions in the comments section at the bottom of this page. And if you're watching from social media, please visit inquirer.com/TrudyLive, one word, to submit your questions. Fiona, I'm delighted to have another chance to discuss all of this with you. So welcome to Inquirer Live. I'd like to start with the current situation with Vladimir Putin. The White House has been trying to make Russia more dependable so it can work on China. Since the Geneva summit in June between Putin and President Biden, top U.S. officials have made 3 trips to Moscow, and other officials have met in neutral countries like Finland and Switzerland. Is this a workable strategy?
Well, look, it may not pan out, but it's the only strategy that we've got. And it's the same strategy that pretty much every administration has tried with Russia, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, if you think about the trajectory of US-Russian relations going back to George Herbert Walker Bush, who was president as the Soviet Union fell apart, there's been an effort by every single president to try to find a way of moving the relationship with Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, away from confrontation, as we had at during the peak of the Cold War, and onto something else. It's not maybe back in the 1990s we had a lot of misplaced expectations about some kind of partnership. Clearly, there were a lot of limits to that, and that wasn't very feasible. And more recently, especially since 2008, when Russia moved into Georgia. That was all before all of the blow up over Ukraine that has continued on since 2014. We've been trying to figure out what kind of formula there can be where we can basically balance deterrence from against the actions that Russia is taking with some form of limited engagement on issues that make sense. Arms control. Now we have climate change, the pandemic that ought to make sense, right? I mean, these are all kind of existential threats that affect all of us. We have the legacy of the Cold War arms control negotiations that did provide an anchor and help change the relationship at the very end of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev and Reagan, and that looked, quite promising. But the problem that we always face is that Russia has a very different view of the security landscape than we do. We're currently, as you're suggesting, preoccupied with China and the rise of China, certainly since 2010, and the Great Recession, the economic crisis that really launched China upward as a major economic player. It wasn't as hard hit as everybody else was by the financial crisis of that era. China's emerging as a major security player and a major military power, that could indeed at some point threaten Russia, as Russia has the largest border with China, largest land border with China in the Asia Pacific region. But, we have moved on from many of the geopolitical perspectives of the 20th century that really framed that relationship with Russia. We don't, this is the United States speaking here, see the geopolitical struggle for Europe as one in which we're trying to kind of divide the continent up. As we were wrestling with the Soviet Union, back in the day. We'd like to see Europe take more responsibility for its security. I mean, clearly we're still engaged there with NATO and the transatlantic alliance, but we're looking, to take that in different directions. Whereas Russia is still fixated on fighting out those old 20th century battles. And they're still looking for some kind of Cold War settlement on their terms. And that also includes, from their perspective, a territorial settlement where they have a recognized sphere of interest. And now we have cyberspace, we have missiles in space, anti-satellite missiles. We just saw the Russians blow up one of their old satellites, putting lots of space debris everywhere, but also showing that they now have the capacity to launch a missile into space and perhaps to, literally blind us as far as our, GPS and other, major satellites and communication systems are concerned. So, this is new domains, new arenas, but still the same old formulation of a confrontation relationship with Russia. And, what can we do? Well, we can deter again. We can try to blunt the impact of things they do. We could certainly, contemplate taking them on militarily. But I don't think there would be an awful lot of support for that, honestly, among the US population. And there certainly isn't among European populations. So we're then left with this dilemma about how we manage this confrontation relationship and still figure out how to push it onto another track. So unless somebody else has got brighter ideas than going out and engaging and, passing on strong messages, this is what we're going to be continuing to see.
Well, you hit several nails on the head there. I mean, China, we're trying to figure out how to deal with a country that is dealing from strength. And this is a major powerhouse. Russia is dealing from weakness. And yet the economy of a midget except for its energy supplies. And yet Putin is playing an awfully clever game and getting a lot of mileage from nibbling here and nibbling there. You were talking about Putin's goals. Does he really want to establish a sphere of influence over the former Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe, the Balkans? What are his goals? Or is he just trying to make life difficult for the United States because he resents us so deeply?
Well, there's all of that. I don't think, he really sees that, kind of it can exert influence over, the domestic and, security policies of places like Poland, for example, some of the former Warsaw Pact. But he can certainly make a new relationship with a country like Hungary, where Viktor Orban, the strongman populist prime minister of Hungary, is quite eager to, basically stiff Europe and his European partners and, carve out a role for himself, and finds it extremely useful. In fact, engaging with Russia, even though Hungary, of course, during the Soviet period, as you know and many others know, was really trying to push for its independence from Russia. A country like Hungary thinks it's actually quite useful to be able to play Russia off against other regional players. The Baltic states are now part of the European Union as well as NATO, but Putin would still like to mess about there in the Baltic states and make it difficult for them, reminding them that they were once part of the old empire. But when it comes to countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, the countries of sort of Central Asia that were part of the former Soviet Union up until its collapse 30 years ago, coming up this December, Putin wants to make it very clear that he wants to exert a veto over everything that they do. And in many respects, he doesn't want those countries to be independently successful or successful as independent states. He wants to show that they're still satellites, as often other leaders in the region have described. He wants them to be shadows of the larger country. And in that way, many of the things that we see the maneuvering is reminding those leaders that they don't have any freedom of maneuver, and that if they want to join NATO and the European Union, like the Baltic states have done, then they should just forget about it. So an awful lot of the pressure that we see on Ukraine in particular right now, and we saw on Georgia previously back in 2008, and we continuously see on the other countries, is to make sure that they don't make any moves into closer association or any kind of other arrangements that might affect the trajectory of their foreign economic policies. And domestically, here's Putin wanting to stay in power, potentially until 2036, maybe even beyond if he feels he's up to it when he's in his 80s and he's still there. And he wants to make the decisions about who succeeds him. And he also then wants to make sure that other countries that have more of a democratic change of leadership, participation and free and fair elections, that they don't succeed at that, because he's trying to kind of basically send a signal that the authoritarian system that he presides over one is much more effective, can deliver more to the population than the chaos of democracy that often leads to conflict and to disarray. And that's kind of what he's trying to show up here in the United States. He's trying to show that we are dysfunctional. He's trying to show that the rest of Europe is dysfunctional, and that the only systems that can deliver these days are strongman authoritarian systems.
He is massing 80,000 Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. And as we know, his invasion of Crimea and annexation was the first such seizure of territory in Europe since World War II. Why should we care about Ukraine? Why should Americans care what happens there? It's not a member of NATO. It's not a treaty ally. And yet the threat of invasion is deeply disturbing Europe and the United States. Why does this matter?
Well, it matters in a global perspective. I mean, you just pointed out this was the first annexation of territory since World War II. It's not been the first invasion of territory. The Turks moved into Cyprus, northern Cyprus, in 1974. And we've seen, continued conflicts on Europe's periphery. And of course, we have the Balkans and, the collapse of Yugoslavia and all of the territorial conflicts that persist. I mean, right now we're talking about the possibility of the Republika Srpska, part of Bosnia-Herzegovina, declaring independence, seceding from this, very complex state that was set up after the Balkan, the most recent round of Balkan Wars. When you say Balkan Wars, many rounds of Balkan Wars. And this is the problem. Europe is beset by numerous territorial disputes, some more quiescent than others, but all of them have the potential to flare up as a result of any kind of further successful intervention by Russia in Ukraine. Because Ukraine, like many other countries that has broken free from an old empire, and this is both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, has had a great deal of difficulty in establishing and consolidating its independent sovereignty and solvency as a major power. Ukraine has economic issues. It's trying to work out a deal with the IMF for a major loan. Look, this could be the history of any other European country. Pick your time in recent and distant history. Every country in Europe is the product of wars over its territory and its borders. So this would kind of set a precedent that here we are at it again. And there are many similar territorial conflicts, border disputes across the world, not least in the Indo-Pacific region with China. I mean, we're wondering about China and Taiwan. What's China going to do with Taiwan? Could Taiwan, and its fate be tied, to, whatever Russia gets away with in Ukraine? Because the Chinese are obviously watching this closely. And it's not just Taiwan. China has a border dispute with India in the Himalayas, and they had a little hot war over that with casualties, particularly on the Indian side. That's just recently. China has a whole host of territorial claims against Japan, Vietnam, you name it, and the various, South and East China Seas, the whole Asia-Pacific region, is beset by territorial conflicts. And closer to home here in the Western Hemisphere, there are plenty of, disputes still, with various Latin and South American countries that could flare up again. Basically, this could open the Pandora's box of territorial disputes. And just to, bear in mind for people who maybe haven't been following this, we had a war between Azerbaijan and Armenia that Russia was supposedly managing until about a year ago. We were trying to head off a resumption of conflict there after 1994, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. And now we have a complete change in the situation there with Russian peacekeepers, basically sitting inside of Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan having, kind of really pressed much further forward, actually quite clearly under the encouragement of Russia. Then Turkey kind of gets into the game as well by supporting Azerbaijan. And the whole of the Caucasus is now on edge. And there's been recent clashes just in the last few days between Armenia and Azerbaijan again on the border region with even more casualties. So you can see here that this could open up an absolute mess. It's not just about Russia and Ukraine. It's what countries can get away with conflict to the neighbours. And then there's Greece and Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean. You name it, there is a conflict wherever we look.
So in a sense, it's a test case. And Russia has every interest, you're saying, in encouraging these ethnic conflicts in countries where it either wants to reassert sway or wants to show that democracies are unable to function, but Russia is. So we have a question: why is Ukraine not a member of the United Nations? Well, it is, and NATO. And so NATO is the operative question. They have asked to be. Clearly, Europe and the United States are not interested in speeding up a process of NATO accession. Why is that?
Well, look, in 2008, Ukraine and Georgia both together requested a membership action plan for NATO at the Bucharest NATO summit. And that was really the kind of occasion on which it was possible to have brought both of them in to, kind of really the sort of entry level that is not a member of NATO, but is, again, a membership action plan. The thing is, that NATO is an organization ruled by consensus. And there had been an incredible negative reaction by Russia to the entry of the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and, others into NATO. And, this was obviously at the behest of those particular countries because they wanted to have longer term protection against Russia. But, there was always those big debates in the 1990s about NATO, the future of NATO, the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council, and even at very early stages about bringing Russia into this. And for Russia, particularly after the bombing by NATO airplanes of Belgrade during the Balkan Wars in 1999, Russia still persisted in seeing NATO as a military alliance that was arrayed against it and its interests. So, every time you were going to bring in a new set of countries into NATO, there was going to be a flare-up. And in 2008, and I mean a flare-up in terms of a negative response from Russia. Russia made that clear after the kind of big bang entry of Eastern European and former, Soviet states, the Baltic states, which of course we'd never recognized as being part of the Soviet Union, just to be clear, into NATO. It made it very clear that was the end. And so it was obvious that next tranche of NATO entrants, perhaps with the exception of some of the countries in the Western Balkans, but, they're also, somewhat still far off with the exception of Montenegro. The whole thing is very complicated, as people can see here. Montenegro is now a member of NATO, but we've still got, Serbia, Kosovo, to contend with here, Northern Macedonia. Russia was going to make that a red line, made it very clear. And so when basically Ukraine and Georgia made the request for a membership action plan in January of 2008, it was pretty late in the game because the Bucharest summit was coming up pretty fast in April. Other countries said no. It's not that we perhaps think that they're not quite ready, because Georgia and Ukraine had done an awful lot to transform themselves militarily. Georgia was working very actively, with NATO and other forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Ukraine had this huge, heavy lift capacity. It was trying to reform its military. It's just that this will become a casus belli, with Russia. Russia made that very clear. And in fact, that's one of the reasons Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. And even with a membership action plan, Russia would still have invaded Georgia because it still wouldn't have been a member in 2008. So what ended up was a compromise in Bucharest, which is frankly the worst of all worlds, because they said no membership action plan, but an open door policy that you can join NATO at some point. That's the same actual policy that's been afforded to Finland and Sweden, which are not part of NATO. And they don't have a membership action plan either, but they, kind of work very closely with NATO in security field. Since then, since the invasion of Georgia, there's been a massive reluctance, obviously, to bring, kind of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, even to start a membership action plan, because everything that Russia is doing is basically geared towards whacking Ukraine and Georgia before they can become members. And now we see, again, getting back to the last question, Putin's testing that proposition to see how far NATO and everybody else are willing to go in defense of a Ukraine that isn't a member, could be some kind of strategic partner, is definitely, kind of working together with NATO forces in exercises. They want to see how far we are prepared militarily to take action. This is a test.
Before talking about your memoir, I want to ask a couple of other questions about Putin testing. And if you could give a couple of brief answers about what is it that we could be doing to push back. The first testing has to do with Russia's supplying gas supplies to Europe. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration tried to get Germany to block a new gas pipeline that was being built from Russia to Germany, Nord Stream 2, because they said it would make Europe more dependent on Russian gas supplies. At first, Biden supported that idea, block it. But then as a favor to Merkel and Germany to renew relations after their difficult period under Trump, he went along with the pipeline. Now Putin is blackmailing, saying he won't give more gas to Europe unless they okay the Nord Stream pipeline. It's open blackmail, as you have said, and I have quoted you. What, at this point, could the US and Europe do to push back?
Well, this is now on Europe. And, there's a very interesting and ironic, and I have to say I have a bit of, as the Germans say, Schadenfreude about this, or otherwise, we told you so. Because since the 1960s and 1970s, the United States has been very consistent. Europe should not make energy pipeline deals with the Soviet Union, then with Russia. So it's not only that we've blocked Nord Stream 2, the number 2 suggests there is a Nord Stream 1. There was a Nord Stream 1, we blocked that too. And we blocked that from both Bush and Obama administrations. And I was in the National Intelligence Council at that time. And boy, did we try everything to basically tell the Europeans not to go down that path. Previously, on Reagan onwards, they've been trying to turn back the pipelines. And, this has been something that's been going on for decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, look, this could be used for blackmail. Europeans have never believed us. The Germans have all said, no, but they haven't. Well, guess what? Now they are. And then, back in 2006, they played with Ukraine, trying to make Ukraine look like an unreliable transit country, because the pipelines go through Ukraine and Belarus to Poland and then, Germany and, everywhere else in Europe. And now this pipeline is going directly from Russia to Germany. And this is now on Germany, because the Germans kept saying, no, it's commercial. No, there's no way that the blackmailers, we're just, we're a great partner. And of course, there are Germans sitting on all of the Gazprom and the pipeline boards here. And so now, guess what, Germany? What we told you, they're blackmailing you. Now you're seeing it's what we've been telling you. So just recently, the Germans have pulled back on some of the final certifications. So, I think in part, not just trying to patch up relations with Germany, because it became all about Germany during Nord Stream 2 debates under Trump. Biden said, okay, fair enough. I mean, we'd slowed it down until, it was getting ridiculous. The Germans weren't taking any action. The Germans were becoming, frankly, rather bloody-minded about it, because the more that they got pressed, the more that we threatened sanctions, Trump threatened all kinds of things, towards them. The worse that relationship got, the more they wanted that pipeline. Well, now it's on them. And so I would just sort of say, he's looking at you, Germany and Europe. You're going to have to do something about this, because what we told you about blatant blackmail is actually happening. Sorry, I'm sounding again a little, I guess.
No,
enjoying that shout of pleasure for the moment, because they didn't believe us until it actually happened. And it's a bit of like awful situations where you can tell people that something might happen and they don't believe you. And when it happens, they say, hang on a second, what's going on? And we said, I mean, sorry, we told you, we could have avoided all of this.
Well, just if you could give a quick answer on another one like that. Russian military intelligence and other agencies have been involved in hacking American sources, both governmental and private. Biden spoke personally to Putin about this. Bill Burns has been in Moscow. And yet, even after the US gave a list of criminal hackers operating in Russia who clearly have to have a Kremlin green light, the situation hasn't changed. What should we be doing? And if you could just comment on that briefly, because I do want to get to your memoir.
Yeah, well, look, actually, we are doing some things behind the scenes as is actually becoming obvious, because there have been the arrests of some ransomware hackers and, the criminals. And many have been indicted. We found out who they are. We could try to block some of their assets, which I think we've already heard news reports about doing. It has to be a public-private venture. I mean, private companies have to be able to provide information about what's going on, so that the hacking and the ransomware attacks can be traced. And we have to work with other European allies. And there's just been a few announcements made that we've seen, might have seen hints of this in the press, that the United States has worked with other European allies, those of whom have been subjected to Russian hacking and ransomware attacks, to try to go after this. We've done this in the past with organized crime and groups that have trafficked in drugs and human beings. Back in the day, in the previous decade, when I was in the intelligence community, we worked with a bunch of Europeans on rolling up a really horrific trafficking organization. And the Europeans did that themselves because it was really in their interest, and they were appalled by what was going on. I don't want to get into any more details there, but it was a small group of countries and intelligence organizations that worked to stop this. So we have a model, we can do this. And there are a number of European countries that really want to step up in this because they've been subjected to the same attacks. And we have, countries like Israel where they've got the news because there's Pegasus spy software, but we know that they're extraordinarily very good at these kinds of operations. And, we have other partners out there who we can work with, not just in the European sphere, to push back on this. And also in terms of financing, we have a lot of ways of following the money. So this is, something that we really can work on. It shouldn't be public, but it should be well and truly made clear to the Russians behind the scenes. I'm sure, during visits like Bill Burns to Moscow, some of these other meetings, that they're being told, look, if you don't do it, we're going to do it.
We have an interesting question here, which relates to your memoir. A listener says, my husband was born and raised in Bishop Auckland.
Oh, my hometown, really?
And left. Should I give her your email? Yeah. A generation before you. And the question is, will England ever transcend its class prejudices?
Well, I really hope that England will transcend its class prejudices, but they're pretty ingrained, and they're going to take, some effort to overcome. And actually, this is one of the reasons, that I wanted to write the memoir, because, there are all kinds of barriers to people getting ahead and opportunity, which feed into our populist politics today. And class in the UK is certainly one of them. And, in the United States, of course, we have many other barriers to opportunity and to social mobility. And class does exist in the United States, but it's kind of pretty much intertwined with a whole host of other issues as well, which makes it more complex. I mean, in the UK, class is like a caste system. I mean, you're literally born into a class. So I was born into the working class. And the ways out of it, complex through education. And, in many respects, you can just short circuit the whole process, as I did, by moving to the United States. And as clearly the listener, the reader's husband did. And in fact, I have many members of my family who did emigrate to the United States in past generations. My one set of great-great-grandparents actually came out to Philadelphia at some point in the 1800s, also to start a new life as well. And so, I've got relations all over the place, relatives, who did the same thing. But look, I mean, the United States and the United Kingdom now have the lowest social mobility of any advanced OECD country, which is appalling. When I came to the United States in 1989, I really did think of this, as the land of opportunity, the land where people could, really move from, one part of the socioeconomic scale to the other. Now there's only a 7% chance in the United States, 7% in single digits, to move from the bottom 20% to the top 20%. And from the bottom, 1% to the top 1%, forget it. That is just, almost a complete impossibility. And in the United Kingdom, it's a bit far behind. And this is, from all the kind of research that's been done into these issues, this is billions of dollars of GDP, that basically is being forfeited by constraining social mobility. And in terms of our politics, this is the premise that the whole of the United States social contract is built on, such as that we have it that's, laid out in the preamble to the Constitution, in terms of the idea of the general welfare, and, the idea that people can improve themselves, that there will be the American dream of moving forward, getting a good job, a good education, and for their children and grandchildren to live better than them. And that's no longer the case. And that's, part of the reason why we have so much polarization and division and, cultural and identity battles in the United States, because people don't see that they're in a shared American polity anymore, because there's so much inequality of opportunity.
You've talked about the similarities that you've observed both in England, in Russia, and in the United States in this growing inequality that feeds populism. Can you just talk briefly about those similarities? And then you've also talked about polarization of America as a threat to U.S. security. You wrote that instead of Russia moving closer to liberal democracy, the U.S. has begun to move closer to Russia as populism, cronyism, and corruption have sapped the strength of American democracy. Talk a bit about that, about polarization of America as a threat to U.S. security.
Yes, I mean, look, the polarization is a definite threat, as I saw, witnessed, and experienced during my time in government and the National Security Council, and I've seen since in looking at polling, about global views about the United States. Because one of the reasons the United States is able to press its interests, more forcefully than other countries is because of the power of our example. And that is, of course, rooted in the power of our economy, which, in general sense, we've still got the most amazing private sector and innovation, and there's an awful lot of success in the United States. And, I'll kind of get to the other point about some of the similarities with the UK and Russia in just a moment, where things are less successful. But obviously, it's not just the size of our military, but it's also the size and capacity of our government. And I don't mean that in the kind of sense of the large, bloated government that people keep thinking about, but, the fact that we have these governmental institutions that people admire, that we also have a vibrant democracy and a system of representational government that people have admired, the way that we've conducted elections in the past. And our power and capacity for collective action to be able to mobilize our diverse and vast institutional representations of government, the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, I mean, you name it, and I'm using those because those examples about normally how we would have dealt with something like a pandemic, to actually set the tone for others about how you do things. Well, we saw during the pandemic, we weren't very good at that at all. And in fact, a lot of our institutions have been hollowed out. Yes, we were able to kind of mount an incredible, innovative research effort and development effort for a vaccine, but we weren't capable of mounting a collective effort to get everybody on board for the public health aspect of dealing with COVID. We still can't get shots in arms of everyone because there's this massive anti-vax movement, which is basically predicated by a complete lack of trust in government and expertise in the scientific community. And that's all kind of emerging out of the various tensions and divisions in the United States that I was referencing before. And in terms of, our national security, the fact that now in polling, in fact, the vast majority of people are saying that the United States is no longer an example, really undercuts our soft power that's always backed up our military power. Nobody sees the United States democratic system, particularly after all of the events from 2016 through 2020, and especially since January 6th and the storming of the Capitol building, there's anything to, basically emulate. They no longer think that the United States democracy is a model, as it had been in the rest of the world. And when people see the United States and members of Congress and others chipping away at voting rights, chipping away at not just the idea of a peaceful transfer of power that we saw January 6th, but the repudiation of electoral outcomes and basically saying that our electoral systems are not to be trusted and that there is no such thing as a free and fair election, that there's massive election fraud when there is not, and that the whole of our system is now reverberating about someone who is perpetrating a big lie about the outcome of the 2020 election. There's a bit of a recoil in horror going on, elsewhere in the world. And that makes the United States look much more like it's headed on a path of other countries towards a sort of an authoritarian system, and certainly the breakdown of our democracy and, many of our civic institutions, because everybody's watching the same things as we are about, attacks on the court system, the independence of the court system, the rise of militias. Nobody outside the rest of the world has ever admired our gun culture, irrespective of our kind of battles and things over this. They just can't understand it. And just the politicization of so many things has made the United States look like a chaotic place that is less attractive to work with, let alone less attractive to come to. And, immigration is at the lowest levels it's been in decades. Notwithstanding what people see at the borders or what they think that they're seeing, legal immigration, let alone illegal immigration, is way lower than it's been before. And then many people, like myself, who came here for graduate school, coming, seeing an opportunity in the United States, are thinking twice and thinking about going, other places. Now, getting back to these comparisons of divisions, a lot of this is rooted in the massive dislocations of deindustrialization, the move from heavy industry and, mass manufacturing that, we built up after World War II to the new, modernized, automated economy, service economy, more financial services, etc., that we started in the 1970s and 1980s. And then, what we now call the Rust Belt of America was never the Rust Belt before. It was the heartland. It wasn't called the Rust Belt, back in the day in the 1940s and 1950s. And in the similar areas of mass manufacturing and heavy industry in the United Kingdom, and then the Soviet Union, Russia, which was just all mass manufacturing and heavy industry, you had, basically millions of people displaced and dislocated by that change. And you did not have a concerted effort of thinking about how people would be retrained and given the opportunity to participate in the new economy. And although, as I said, we've massive success in the United States of innovation and technological breakthroughs, we've still got large swathes of places in the United States, including in Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley, and elsewhere, where new industry has not moved in to replace the old. That's certainly the case in the whole of the north of England, where I came from. And it's the case in vast swathes of Russia outside of Moscow, which has become this mega, highly connected city where all innovation takes place, and the rest of, kind of Russia, not the same. And that has really fed into populist politics. If we look at all of the places that voted for Vladimir Putin, for example, in Russia, they're all the old industrial places. They're not the big, vibrant cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. If we look in the north of England or Britain, the places that voted for Brexit to leave the European Union and then voted for the Tories, who are promising a different agenda in 2019, they're all the old industrial areas and the places that have not bounced back under the new economy. And if we look at 2016 in particular, it's more complex than 2020, but 2016 in particular, the 70,000 votes that swayed the Electoral College in favor of Donald Trump in that election were from, places, counties in particular, that had seen hard socioeconomic times. Of course, there's a lot more complexity to this, but you can actually see quite clearly those cleavages in all three countries, some on a different scale to others.
There's so much I want to ask you. I have a couple of questions. We only have about 6 minutes left. I want to get in a question on human rights and then turn to Russia and China. On human rights, Putin is truly cracking down in a way that he hadn't before, more severely on the opposition. The Kremlin is about to ban one of the oldest human rights and groups, Memorial. And of course, Alexei Navalny, having been poisoned, is now in prison, and nobody knows if he will survive there. Is there anything more the US and Europe could be doing to save Navalny or to affect the domestic crackdown in Russia?
Look, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And I'll just point people toward the summit between Putin and Biden in Geneva, where they gave their separate press conferences. And Putin was asked a question about human rights in Russia. And what did he do? He turned it right back on the United States. He said, well, what about the United States? He talked about Black Lives Matter, racial tensions, kind of, as always, that Russia has done, is hone right in on racial divisions in the United States and the United States' sad and sorry history of racial discrimination and slavery. They've done that since, forever. And then also moved in on January 6th and talked about political protest and, kind of immediately ran right head into, with, kind of great pleasure, into this whole debate about January 6th, knowing full well that he was pushing all the kinds of buttons about what happened and, the efforts to make the mob that stormed the Capitol into political martyrs in some circles. So Putin loves that. So right away, putting us on notice, don't you dare clean up your own act before you come, to push me on human rights. And that is going to be our dilemma. While the United States and other European countries, and, looking at what Poland, the whole refugee crisis on the border with Belarus, where Poland and other countries won't take in refugees, where the European Union, has also, been accused of awful human rights abuses by, some of the treatment of refugees, particularly, you see court cases now in Italy for human rights groups and other groups who want to try to rescue migrants who are drowning in the Mediterranean, and they're actually being put on trial for terrorism. Kind of Putin and others can point to that and say, hello, who's worse here? So one of our big problems is fixing ourselves. I mean, again, it gets back to that point about the power of our example. Yes, we can take some actions, and I think there is a lot of pressure on what the Putin and others are doing against Navalny. But while we're not fixing our own issues and showing the power of our example, Putin will always say, "Who are you to tell me anything?" And this is one of the dilemmas that we have in this upcoming democracy summit, where it's been framed about democracies versus authoritarian systems. Look, these authoritarian systems are cliques around men, strong men, who want to keep their position. There's not much ideology going on, even in supposedly communist China. So it's all about a particular clique of people who want to stay in power, and they'll use ideology, they'll use anything that they can, basically conservatism, religion. That's what Putin is doing too. Things that they don't really believe in, but to, basically create and shape a justification for them, being in power. But really where democracy is most at risk is here in Western countries and in other countries around the world where we've had a lot of slip back, where we've had the emergence of illiberal democracies in Hungary. We worried very much about Poland. It's not, quite the same as in Hungary, but, we've got a lot of problems going on here. And we have to show that we can fix our own democracies so that it can deliver politically and economically, for all the promises that they've made to their citizens. And then, that power of example is going to be much more impactful.
We have a minute left. And just to pick up on that point, as you say, fixing ourselves is the key to dealing with Putin. How nervous should we be about his alliance with China? And if you have a couple of other quick points on how the US and Europe together could push back against Putin, beside the most important one, fixing ourselves.
Yeah, because fixing ourselves is going to take some time, right? Multi-generational. So, I mean, I'm with everybody. That's not the kind of practical. It's the only solution over the longer term, but it's not practical to pull all that off by next week, for example. So in terms of, China and Russia, yes, we should be concerned that, both of them have really forged what looks like increasingly a strategic partnership. There's more interest in this from Russia than there is China, but it's incredibly useful for China. Let's just say right now to have Russia acting as the kind of international attack dog and pushing back against the United States and everybody else as well. And China's watching very closely what Russia does, including in Ukraine and elsewhere, and seeing what Russia can get away with and, how Russia can kind of open doors there. So we have to figure out how we can push back on that as well as on Putin. That's where I say we have to be very focused on our diplomatic efforts. The United States can't do all of this on its own. We shouldn't want to do this on its own because there's a lot of complexity. We have to work very close with as many European allies as we can and others as well. India, which has a lot of concerns about China and Russia. Japan, which has similar concerns about China and Russia, but also about Putin and, Putin's Russia, because, Japan have conflicts with Russia as well, territorial conflicts, the Northern Territories, the Kuril Islands. So we have to be very creative in our diplomacy. We can't just look at this as a European issue because, Russia pops up all over the place. Venezuela, for example, not so recently, Russia likes to flex its muscles with displays of power of sending, warplanes over Hawaii. We've got to be really focused on how do we blunt the impact of what Putin does. And, getting back to a comment you said, before about corruption, it was a quotation from a piece that I wrote in the Foreign Affairs article. We have to really clean up our own act very quickly. And we can do that on the financial, corruption element. We've got all these places that you can have shell companies, from South Dakota to Delaware and Miami in the United States. We can start to regulate that and to put a lot of our own laws in place about financial impropriety.
Thank you so much. I think the message here is America, heal thyself. And in the meantime, I highly recommend that you read Fiona's memoir, There Is Nothing for You Here, in which she talks at more length about her childhood, which is fascinating, and about everything that we've been discussing. Thanks so much for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you again on Inquirer Live in January. Have a good holiday season.
Thanks, Trudy, and thank you, everyone.